Hello, my name is Mark Sutton, and welcome to this short video lecture. Today, I'll introduce you to three basic moves writers frequently make when they write an analytic essay. Before we discuss those particular moves, let's take a moment to define analysis, which is a common genre seen in multiple disciplines and classes. When we write an analysis, we take our subject apart, breaking it into its individual components. Then we try to determine and explain the relationships among those components. Exactly why we want to explain those relationships can vary. A process analysis, for example, examines the steps people or devices go through to complete a particular task. Scientists and technicians can use that analysis to try to develop ways to make the process work better. In humanities-based courses like English, texts tend to be the object of analysis, and the goal of those analyses is frequently interpretive. We want to decide why the writer made particular choices, or what those choices tell us about some larger idea. The way we break up a text varies depending on what we want to find. We could, for example, be interested in how the creator of an editorial uses the major rhetorical appeals to try to persuade the audience, or how a poet uses a set of metaphors to convey a larger message about life. Regardless of what our analysis looks for, the written form of it tends to contain three moves: a claim, evidence, and explanation. One way to visualize these moves is through a setup called the analytic triangle. I learned about this heuristic in graduate school from one of my fellow students, Lee Davinroy. As far as I know, she created it. Let's look at each of these moves one at a time. To help illustrate them, we'll use the example of a mystery, the case of the stolen cake. As any good detective knows, a mystery is a type of analysis, where we try to piece together different elements from the crime scene to determine who committed the crime. A claim is the point you're trying to support through your analysis. It represents the meaning of the different patterns we see when taking apart our artifact. Here's an example claim for our sample mystery. Little Boy Blue stole Old Mother Hubbard's chocolate peanut butter cake. It tells us who the detective thinks committed the crime. Claims by themselves aren't enough to construct an analysis. We need the next part of the analytic triangle, evidence. Evidence is specific details from an artifact used to support a claim. The form the evidence takes can vary depending on what you are analyzing. If you're analyzing a piece of writing, the evidence will be words or phrases. If you're analyzing an advertisement, the evidence will be the images and colors you see in the advertisement. Let's look at some of the evidence in our sample case, and I'll give you a few seconds to review this before I resume talking. As you can see, these details are the kind of things we would expect to see at a crime scene. This evidence may seem to create an open and shut case. However, evidence can always be interpreted in different ways, and we cannot assume the reader of our analysis will understand the evidence in the same way we do. We have to guide their thinking, and we do that through the last element of the analytic triangle, explanation. Explanation tells your audience how the evidence supports the claim. In other words, it provides a connection readers need to interpret the evidence in the way you want them to. Without that connection, your audience may interpret things in completely different ways, or they may think you're just summarizing or describing the artifact instead of probing how or why it works in the way it does. Let's look at some examples of explanation a lawyer might use when prosecuting Little Boy Blue. If Little Boy Blue is the only subject who wears a blue coat, and a blue coat was found on the scene, it's likely the coat belongs to him. Similarly, if his gloves were covered in the same type of icing used for the cake, it seems likely that he touched the cake. Explanation can also work to eliminate an interpretation. If Little Bo Peep can't eat peanut butter, she is less likely to eat the cake, so she can't be the criminal. Looks like Little Boy Blue is in some trouble. Let's take a second to review the concepts discussed in this video. Analytic writing breaks an item into its components and explains the relationships among those components. This genre tends to use the same three moves. It centers around a claim, the point the writer is trying to prove through the analysis. That claim is supported with evidence, specific details taken from the artifact. Because evidence can be interpreted in many different ways, we often have to add explanation that helps the audience see the connection between the claim and the evidence. While analytic paragraphs typically start with a claim, there's no rule that says they have to. As a writer, you have to determine how to best organize these components given the rhetorical situation in which you are working. Your purpose, audience, and context will tell you how to best manipulate these components. so that your insights on the artifact and on how it works can be conveyed to your readers. Your instructor may have additional information on this concept. Be sure to talk with them if you have additional questions.